Now I'd like to introduce our second speaker, Thea Ormerod. Thea is a Catholic Christian, a semi-retired social worker, grandmother, and an advocate for action to curb global warming. She's long been involved in a range of social justice issues, mainly concerning global poverty. For the last 11 years, Thea has been involved in the multi-faith climate action organisation, the Australian Religious Response to Climate Change, ARRCC, and she is currently the president. Thea will talk about why hundreds of cities, states and religious leaders such as Pope Francis have declared a climate emergency and how some forms of hope might be possible. Would you please welcome Thea?
Thank you. I'd first like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Just a bit of background on ARRCC. We're a multi-faith organisation, so we have Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, Christians of all denominations, and for 11 years we've been working in the sort of climate advocacy space. At this time in history, global heating has progressed to only just over 1 degree centigrade, and yet we already see catastrophic effects such as our unprecedented drought and bushfire emergency. Worse still, even if all countries meet their commitments to the Paris Accord, we're on a trajectory to 3 degrees C. Many people still don't get it, even if they acknowledge the scientists are probably right. However, when people do realise the gravity of our situation, they tend to go straight to despair. Some go to panic, but then do their best not to think about it. However, it's still right to use the term emergency, because a rapid response is needed, and the research indicates that fear actually is a motivator of action. And frankly, I think we should be telling the truth. You know, if we're in real trouble, you know, if you're in a sinking lifeboat or if your ship is sinking, you don't want to be somewhere on the boat not knowing about it. You would be wanting to go to the life rafts and do something. Anyone who is truly aware of our predicament will be struggling to maintain hope, struggling to believe that it is still possible to avoid the worst of climate breakdown. Those of us who are people of faith search our traditions for resources to cope with this climate emergency. Some of the Buddhists among us might turn to meditation or the image of the Jambala warrior. Some of us in the Abrahamic traditions might seek out a personal God who journeys with us, whatever perils we are facing. Most traditions offer some form of spiritual sustenance and moral compass to guide us in this darkness. One thing we cannot do is give up. We believers who are relatively privileged in this world owe it to coming generations and those in vulnerable parts of the world who have no voice to do all we can to stop the climate juggernaut from doing its worst. Indeed, we need to keep listening to those voices. How inspiring have the student strikers been? A good question to guide any responsible citizen today when we're feeling low is, in 30 years' time, when these young people are in their 40s and 50s, struggling with the mess our generation has made, what would they have liked us to do? One thing's for sure, it doesn't include giving up. ARRCC is one organisation among many that is fighting for a viable future. Established in 2007, we're multi-faith, a registered charity and not tied to any particular institution, which gives us a lot of freedom. We've now grown to over 5,000 supporters. Our vision is essentially twofold. Firstly, we advocate for government policies and business practices which would help put the brakes on climate breakdown. We believe the theology is all there now, and there is a place for spirituality, but our faith must show itself in real, on-the-ground, effective action. Secondly, we encourage communities across Australia to embrace lifestyle options which would reflect caring for the earth. Advocacy for social change has very much been our priority, but the call to live ethically as human beings is at the heart of each of our faith traditions. So it's a natural starting point for believers. It's also where many conservative communities are still at. From ARRCC's early days, inspired by our Hindu, Brahmakumaris, Krishna and Buddhist supporters, the Eat Less Meat campaign has been an important dimension of our work. From a scientific perspective, From a scientific perspective, meat consumption, particularly red meat consumption, leads to highly destructive methane emissions. But we know that facts on their own do not change behaviour. People shift when the direction of change suits the aspirations or values they hold for other reasons. So ARRCC has always promoted the co-benefits of eating less meat, as well as the climate impact. Good health and well-being, enjoyment of nourishing food, kindness to animals, and alignment with the aspiration to live compassionately. Similarly, we promote the co-benefits of active transport, installing solar, using public transport, even flying less, as part of our current campaign called Living the Change. It's actually a global campaign attempting to ignite enthusiasm for sustainable living among religious believers as one way to help keep warming under 1.5 degrees. It's predicated on the research of Kevin Anderson and others that if the world's top 10% of carbon emitters, which includes most people in Australia, were to cut emissions to the level of the average European, not the average African or the average Indian, global emissions would decline by 33%. So we actually consume disproportionately. Australia is the highest per capita in terms of carbon emissions per person. I've said that twice. Nonetheless, ARRCC's priority is to add a broadly based faith voice to the climate debate in Australia. On the whole, our positions have been described as uncompromising because they're aligned with the requirements of climate science and social justice. Guided by the moral imperatives embedded in our faith traditions, we don't shrink from a prophetic role, even if this appears impractical to some. Over the years, we've published a number of open letters, made submissions, written our own letters, and visited members of Parliament. We've participated in public protests and held actions of our own. In the last 18 months, we have coordinated the publication of several open letters signed by a range of senior and not so senior leaders in diverse communities. Mehmet is always one of our reliable signatories. But we've also had a number of imams. The president of the Australian Council of Imams has signed. Each letter urging a shift away from coal mining to support renewable energy. Over 50 leaders signed a letter to Ghutam Adani in June 2018. 154 to the Prime Minister just after he won the election, and over 70 international faith leaders wrote to Ghutam Adani in October 2019. Our supporters have also joined the school strikes for climate in large numbers. and we've made the most of high-level support from bishops and churches for the strikers on social media. We've held carols against coal events and encouraged, that got a lot of media, the Conservatives hated it, and encouraged believers to display anti-coal signs outside dozens of places of worship. There's one in Pitt Street Uniting Church, one outside of Pitt Street. Our supporters have held funerals for coal, prayer vigils outside and inside Commonwealth Bank offices in the past, and more recently inside and outside the offices of engineering firm GHD, to urge them not to do business with Adani. On 2 occasions, groups of ARRCC supporters, Lucy was there at this one, groups of ARRCC supporters have organised themselves to peacefully hold up work on Adani's Carmichael project on the front lines in Queensland, leading to 11 arrests. We didn't organise it, you know, it was our supporters organised it, right? In a context where our elected leaders are letting us down and hope is hard to come by, Australia needs movements of people to rise up and create the change that is so urgently needed. Among faith communities, ARRCC makes a modest attempt to create such a movement, to provide ways for believers to live out their values with integrity and strategically pressure big business and governments to do the right thing. We must not give up. For the sake of the voiceless poor, for the sake of life on earth, and for future generations.